Eu tava triste, tristinho, mas sem graça que a top model magrela na passarela. Eu tava sozinho, mais solitário que um paulistano, que o canastrão na hora que cai o pano.
Oi, gente. Hoje eu vou falar sobre o povo brasileiro, que é um povo arretado demais. Mas para ser específico, eu quero falar sobre o famoso jeitinho brasileiro, que se entende como uma forma improvisada e informal de resolver os problemas. Geralmente pode ser uma coisa boa, mas infelizmente também é uma forma para as pessoas se esquivarem a lei para conseguir algum benefício pessoal e privado. E daí, pois, naturalmente, isso leva à corrupção, meus amigos. Ou seja, uma cultura de corrupção que acaba impedindo ambos a democracia e também o desenvolvimento econômico. Entendeu? Tudo bem. But before we get to all that, let's address a bigger question. What is culture, and can it explain why some societies are so much richer and more developed than others? On its conceptual surface, culture is super easy to define. It is, in essence, just the collection of norms, beliefs, and attitudes and practices that people in a given society adhere to on a daily basis. Okay, good so far. But how can we go about operationalizing this variable? That is, how do we define the parameters of a cultural group? And how can we even measure culture itself? Now, defining its parameters is the first big pickle. Back in the early 1900s, the sociologist Max Weber published a series of books that linked culture to religion, arguing that different religious orthodoxies generated meaningfully distinct sets of beliefs and attitudes that, taken together, helped to determine a society's propensity to develop economically or not. Now, according to his analysis, Catholic countries were doomed to underdevelopment. This was because the Catholic Church instructed its followers to humbly accept their impoverished condition in this world so that God might look favorably upon them in the next. Now, Protestant societies, on the other hand, they enjoyed a natural affinity with capitalism, and they grew rich, thanks to the Calvinist doctrine of predetermination, which incentivized individuals to work hard, to save, to invest, and to innovate in order to prove to their co-religionists that they were, beyond a shadow of doubt, among God's chosen ones. Now, Weber didn't restrict his cultural analysis to Christianity, of course. India, he argued, was poor because of the Hindu caste system, which promoted fatalistic attitudes about economic enterprise by denying the right of social mobility to the masses. The Middle East, for its part, was poor because Muhammad had outlawed usury, the practice of lending money, at the inception of Islam. China, meanwhile, was poor because Confucian philosophy instructed people to frown upon those who flaunt any kind of personal achievement. A truly anti-capitalist attitude, if there ever was such a thing. And well, linking culture to religious orthodoxy did make a lot of sense, especially at the turn of the 19th century, when scientific rationalism had only just begun to bite at the heels of religion and threaten its grip on politics and society. It makes a bit less sense now that the world has overall become much more secular. But even in the time of Weber, culturalist theories of development never settled on just one set of parameters or measurement. For example, a rather large body of theory in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries pointed to climate as a determinant of development positive or development negative cultures. Generally, it was argued that the colder climes of the global north compelled people to work hard and to work together in the months of summer in order to survive those brutish snowy winters. And these practices, they engendered a culture of hard work and mutual trust, both of which are important traits for production and trade, i.e. economic development. In the tropics, by contrast, food tended to be abundant and easily collected all year round. And over time, this produced a culture in which things like hard work and social trust were less valued. I mean, why would you toil in the dirt with a hoe all summer long if mangoes, coconuts, and flying fish fell into your lap all year round? Later on, in the post-World War II era, modernization theory flipped the culture development thesis on its head, popularizing the idea that economic development itself is a force of change in culture, making it more amenable to capitalism. According to this body of theory, traditional societies are characterized by a cultural tendency to adhere to more rigid social hierarchies and to resist innovation or change of any kind. All bad things for capitalism. But if you somehow can weasel in some hardcore economic development anyway, say through a big international aid package bent on establishing an industrial economy, well, then what do? You provide the conditions for a massive cultural shift, one in which capitalism-friendly traits like secularism, cosmopolitanism, and the belief in social mobility itself begin to develop. Oh yeah, all these things are really good for capitalism. But wait, the cultural argument doesn't stop there. It can't. After all, in the decades since modernization theory's heyday, a great many projects of economic development have, well, failed to change cultural attitudes in many parts of the world. And this has led to more recent culturalist scholars to point back to sources of cultural production more deeply rooted in history. In the 1990s, for example, a political scientist named Robert Putnam attributed higher levels of social trust in northern Italy versus southern Italy to the creation of artisan guilds in Milan over 800 years ago. Meanwhile, southern Italy, lacking any collectivist movement during that pivotal time period, and also having been occupied periodically by foreign invaders, well, they engendered a different culture, a culture of personal distrust, which later on fueled the rise of the mafia. And yeah, none of that was good for capitalist development. But it doesn't end there. Culturalist theories tend to proliferate forever, on. And in doing so, they create something of a problem for us academic types, particularly with respect to culture's parameters and measurement. For example, where does culture begin and where does it end? What happens when the parameters of culture overlap? Like, say, when we talk about Western versus Eastern civilization, or Christian versus Muslim countries, or colonizer versus colonized countries, or American culture versus Mexican culture, or white versus black, rich versus poor, rural versus urban, etc. You see, all of these categories can be understood, and in different academic circles that really are understood, as actual sources of cultural production that can have real implications for political and economic development. It's a bit, well, overwhelming. And on top of that, with culturalist theories, we often run into problems of logical consistency, especially when the very thing that we think culture predicts suddenly changes. For instance, what happens when China, which is supposedly poor because of Confucian culture, suddenly grows rich, as it has done in the last 20 years? You guessed it. Recent culturalist theories have also explained that, suggesting that so-called Asian values, those same Confucianist ones that frown upon the flaunting of individual achievement, but also honor the family before the individual, well, these values are actually good for capitalist growth because they encourage frugality, hard work, and saving. When does it all end? Oh, and finally, one last little problem. Ethically speaking, the whole tradition of linking political and economic outcomes to culture is, well, kind of a sketchy enterprise, and one that is uniquely given to all sorts of nasty backlash from one's peers. And this is simply because, in one form or another, employing culture as a causal force behind outcomes that we deem either good or bad can easily be interpreted as just a fancy-clad way of reproducing existing societal prejudices, plain and simple. Like, say, oh yeah, Mexico, it's underdeveloped because, they got a lot of Mexicans there, and you know how they are. And yet, despite these problems, culturalist theories of political and economic development, well, they keep popping up. Why is this? Well, if you ask me or anyone else who has lived and worked in rich and poor countries alike, well, you probably get an answer that sounds more or less like this. Cultural beliefs, attitudes, practices, oh yeah, they're real, all right, and they definitely affect the way political and economic processes work. No doubt about it. And this brings me back to the famous Jeitinho here in Brazil. As I mentioned earlier, the Brazilian Jeitinho refers to a sort of loose, improvised way in which Brazilians solve problems or just get things done in general. And Brazilians, they tend to pride themselves for their talent in this regard. So much so, in fact, that the figure of the malandro, the petty swindler or hustler who avoids a life of work by pulling all the right strings in his social network. He's something of a national hero. And on some level, that's all cookies and ice cream. No problem at all. And you can take it from me, exercising one's Jeitinho skills to get things moving and shaking in a world of utterly ridiculous bureaucratic hurdles, well, that can be pretty fun. The problem of the Jeitinho is that as part of the cultural bedrock of Brazilian society, it infuses political and economic processes with a tendency for graft and corruption that undermines fair competition across the board. Two things explain this point. First, o Jeitinho is really all about fixing private problems, not public ones. And in the political world, this means one's political talents are employed not to improve society so much as to funnel public resources into private hands. Here's a recent example. Last August in the city of Recife, near where I am right now, the state medical director in the state of Pernambuco was caught embezzling millions of dollars in federal monies that were supposed to go towards COVID-19 treatment programs. The man was charged for his crimes, but the lead prosecutor in the case assured me that he would really never end up going to jail or doing time. And why? Well, naturally, he used a lot of that money to pay off a ring of judges and special investigators who would protect them. Now, all of them had a lot of Jeitinho, apparently. And this brings me to the second problem of Jeitinho. This particular cultural norm, you see, makes a mockery of the kind of meritocratic and procedural institutions that constitute what we call the modern rational bureaucratic state, to use Max Weber's terms. In other words, culturally speaking, Brazilians don't expect their political institutions to work or work right. And so they don't even try to hold those institutions accountable. Now, of course, I'm generalizing here, and there are clear signs that political culture here is shifting somewhat. I mean, after all, culture is never static. But take, for example, an extremely common phrase heard during electoral campaigns here in Brazil. Ele rouba, mas faz. In English, this translates roughly as, he steals, but he helps us out, referring to politicians of any level, but usually mayors and state governors and such. And what do they mean when they say that? Well, if you're an elected politician, you are essentially expected to steal. That's not really a problem because that's the norm. The important thing is that your supporters have some type of private access to public benefits by way of their own Jeitinho with your administration. In political science terminology, we call this clientelism. And, well, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely not conducive to economic development. But what do you think? What is culture? And does it make sense to treat it as a causal force in political and economic outcomes? I'm Professor Michael Wolff, and this is the Politics of Development Online.
I fly like paper, get high like planes. If you catch me at the border, I got visas in my name. If you come around here, I'll make 'em all day. I get one down in a second if you wait. All I wanna do is take your money. All I wanna do is take your money.
Oi, gente. Te amo. São bem legais.
Eita!